Obviously, I think it is negative that Russia is making progress and pushing Ukrainian forces back. It is inflicting grievous civilian casualties through its campaign of aerial bombardments against Ukrainian civilian populations. It is pushing the Ukrainian army back from key towns in the east of the country and continuing its invasion. But conversely, Ukraine is making progress in its strategic strike campaign against Russian uh, infrastructure and munitions facilities.
Now, we're speaking about some of the Russian advances. From your point of view, why are Russia's recent advances in the East, particularly, described as strategic?
Well, Russia is gaining ground in the east. It's pursuing its offensive through the Donbass, trying to take as much of the Donbass as possible, which it annexed illegally, and wishes to at least claim all of that territory and physically occupy it. And of course, each town it captures, aids in that process. And after more than 2 years of fighting, it succeeded in taking Vuhledar, and it's also pursuing a campaign in Pokrovsk. Excuse my pronunciation, which, you know, if it can take key Ukrainian towns, which are hubs in Ukraine's local transportation infrastructure, that will make a difference to its campaign. But ultimately, these are at the moment tactical victories rather than strategic victories. They are not yet at the stage where they are changing the fundamental direction of the war.
But from your point of view, Dr. Bosbotinies, what are the factors that led to those Russian victories as you described them?
I think it's a combination of factors. The Russians obviously have a much, much higher tolerance for casualties on their own side than Western armed forces would. So they are employing the so-called meat grinder tactics, where they are just employing large numbers of troops in relentless attacks on Ukrainian positions. The Russians had the advantage in the weight of fire they can bring to bear against the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have manpower constraints, they've had munitions constraints. They haven't got sufficient air defenses to be able to provide air defense of key civilian centers of population, their major cities and infrastructure, and forward defense on the battlefield. So obviously they are prioritizing defense. Means the Russian support of their ground forces. So there's all these factors coming into play: manpower constraints, munitions shortages, Russian advantages in numbers, Russian tolerance for mass casualties, and it's having a slow grinding attritional effect on the battlefield in the east, allowing Russia to make slow progress.
How could these tactical, as you described, strategic, as other describes, victories affect the next stages of the war?
Well, I think as the Russians gain ground, there is always the risk that political support in the West might shift and more pressure brought to bear, perhaps for some sort of ceasefire along a line of control. Plus, there is the potential that Russian advances could, for example, lead to Ukrainian troops having to pull back and a defensive line being breached and the Russians being able to gain more ground. Although that is perhaps unlikely at the moment. Uh, the main problem for Ukraine is its manpower shortages and the fact that going into the winter, it faces again the threat of Russian strikes against its critical national infrastructure and all that entails for its civilian population. Uh, we are coming up now for the period of bad weather in Ukraine where military movements are slowed down because of the mud. So there may be more stabilization in the east for the coming months.
So, from your point of view, how will the US and its NATO allies respond to Russia's recent field advances or victories? And are they willing to lend more support to Ukraine?
Hopefully, as the Ukrainians demonstrate that Russian supposed red lines and threats regarding strikes on Russian territory constitute some sort of precursor to a major Russian escalation are false. Through, for example, Ukraine's use of its own indigenous weapon systems in strikes on mainland Russian targets and its offensive into Kursk, that the United States can lift its ban on Western weapon systems being used in strikes on Russian territory, enabling, for example, American-supplied ATACMS, British-supplied Storm Shadow cruise missiles to be used in strikes against targets in Russia proper. That would greatly assist in
Yes.
Ukrainian defensive efforts.